In this video, I'll be showing you how to use fiberglass and epoxy resin to laminate your board. I'm using a 4-ounce fiberglass cloth, which adds strength to the board when saturated in the epoxy resin, which also waterproofs the entire exterior. Fiberglass cloth does come in heavier cloths like 6 ounces, which will add more strength and is common for glassing softer materials like foam surfboards. But we found the 4-ounce cloth on the 1/4-inch cedar deck, when built and glassed properly, is enough to hold the weight of most paddlers without the wood deflecting. If you're building this board alone and you don't have a friend to help pull the fiberglass neatly over your board, I like to run a dowel through the fiberglass roll and hang it horizontally on my pegboard tool walls so that I can easily pull the roll over my board. Also, when you're going to be working with epoxy resin, you definitely want to lay down a layer of plastic or paper ground cover to make cleanup much easier, because the epoxy is going to drip off the sides of your board a little bit. That being said, you can wipe off unhardened epoxy from your floor with a rag and some acetone if some of the resin did manage to land on your floor and not on the drop cloth. Okay, now that your board is covered completely with your fiberglass cloth, you're going to trim the excess around the perimeter of your board. When cutting fiberglass, I like to wear a respirator because I really don't want to accidentally ingest tiny shards of fiberglass that might be floating in the air when I'm cutting the cloth. So this trim line does not have to be perfect if you're using a cut lap like I am, but you do want to make sure that the fiberglass will completely cover your rail material and end somewhere in the middle of your tape line, so that it can be peeled off and cut later. You'll be repeating this fiberglassing process on the bottom side after this side cures, so your rails do get a double layer of glass for added strength and protection. Make sure to save the excess material that you cut off, because this can come in handy for other projects like making wooden fins or paddles and other cool projects. Lastly, just make some relief cuts at the corners near the nose and the tail so that the cloth folds around neatly. One thing people like to do in the surfboard shaping world is to add decals, logos, or other graphics to their boards using rice paper that they've printed their designs on, which is what I'm choosing to do here. This paper is added underneath the fiberglass cloth before lamination. I'm adding the Jarvis Boards logo in the front of the board, as you can see here. If you're adding a graphic with the rice paper method, just cut out your printed design and place it where you want on your board, then roll the fiberglass back over neatly. The epoxy that you're going to add later saturates the rice paper, which makes it transparent, leaving only the printed portion of your graphic behind. It's best to use darker ink when printing for best results. Okay, now for the fun part. I'm mixing 24 ounces of my 2-to-1 epoxy resin here. So that's 16 ounces of epoxy and 8 ounces of the slow hardener, which will give me sufficient working time to fully saturate my board without feeling too rushed during the curing process. You want to use a clean mixing cup and slowly pour the epoxy first, and then add the hardening agent second. I was a little sloppy here, but you want to try to avoid bubbles forming as you're pouring and mixing so they don't show up in your glass job. As soon as you've mixed the two parts, your epoxy resin will begin an exothermic chemical reaction, and the mixture that sits in the cup actually will start to get hot and cure much faster in the cup than it does when it's poured out and spread out over your board. This just means that you don't want a large volume of epoxy like this sitting in the cup too long. Make sure to check the working time and the pot life of the resin you're using. I've got about 40 minutes to work this into my cloth. Stir the epoxy thoroughly for a minute or two, scraping the sides and the bottom of the cup to get a good, even mixture. Again, trying not to aggressively whip the epoxy, causing bubbles to form. Once mixed thoroughly, I poured about 3/4 of the mixed epoxy down the center of my board and began to gently push the epoxy around the fiberglass with my squeegee. You'll notice the epoxy fills the weave and makes the board look wet, which is exactly what you're looking for. I like to work my way up and down the board lengthwise with my squeegee, keeping as much of the epoxy resin on top of the board and not flowing off the sides quite yet. You'll want to pay a little extra attention to your rice paper graphic with your squeegee to ensure that it fully wets out and there aren't any trapped air bubbles. Once I've pretty much saturated the entire top surface, I start pulling the excess epoxy from the middle towards the side rails, applying a medium pressure with the plastic squeegee, which leaves a full but not overly saturated weave. This is also when I might use the rest of the epoxy in my mixing cup to help get a good saturation over the rails. We'll be adding a fill coat or a hot coat in our next video that will cover up the fiberglass texture, so you should expect to see that cloth during this step. Continue working your way around the board and saturating those side rails, and then using your squeegee to wrap the ends of the fiberglass under the board and then onto the bottom side over the middle of the tape line if you're using a cut lap. After you've got most of your cloth saturated, I like to squeegee around the entire board once more with medium firmness, pulling any excess epoxy pools from the center of the board outwards towards the sides, and ensure there's no air trapped anywhere and the fiberglass is pressed neatly around the entire surface. There's a couple things to do in order to prepare for glassing the other side. If you watched my last video, you remember that I chose to do a cut lap on this board, so I applied some masking tape underneath the board where the fiberglass overlaps. That tape needs to be removed, obviously, before I want to glass the other side. You also could have used a free lap style, which uses no tape. To make the process of cutting this tape line easier, you'll want to wait until your epoxy is maybe 60 to 75% cure or hardened, so it should still be a little tacky and bonded to the board, but it's still a little flexible. On this top side of the board, I actually waited a little too long and accidentally let my epoxy fully cure. So when I flipped the board over and cut my tape line with a razor blade, it just took a little more extra work with my blade and some sandpaper because the epoxy was fully hardened. After you've cut all the tape away, let the rest of the board fully harden and then knock down the small cut line with some fine grit sandpaper and clean up the nose and the tail where the relief cuts might not have been perfectly wrapped around. The last preparation step you'll see me do here is taping off the lap line on the top of the board that's now fully glassed and cured. So I just applied that masking tape about 1/8 inch away from the side rail lumber, this time just using one piece of wide masking tape to make cutting it off with a razor blade later a little easier. Then it's the same process as before. You're going to flip your board back over, apply any rice paper graphics you might want to include, pull that fiberglass cloth over your board, trim the excess so it will overlap onto your masking tape line, and you're ready to mix and pour your epoxy resin again. Just use the same amount of epoxy as you used on the top side unless you were close to running short or you had a little bit too much excess. It's always better to mix a little bit more than you might need, in my opinion, just so you don't get caught without any epoxy in the middle of your glass job. Spread your epoxy across your board until the fiberglass cloth is completely saturated. And one little trick that might help you with the rails is to use your gloved hand and a squeegee to kind of pre-saturate that fiberglass before you actually go to wrap it underneath the rails. After you've pulled any pools of epoxy off the board, let it cure about 75% of the way, and then follow your tape line with a razor blade. You can just see just how much easier it is for me to make that cut when it's not fully hardened. And lastly, once the epoxy is fully cured, knock down that tape line and any imperfections around the relief cuts with some fine grit sandpaper. And that's how you laminate the top and bottom side of your board. In the next video, we'll be applying what's called a hot coat to the board, which will fill the visible weave of the fiberglass cloth and leave you with a really nice glossy finish.